Hello, history lovers. When I first came up with this channel, my sister Rue had inspired me because she knew how much I loved history. I already had two YouTube channels, but I was excited at the idea of making a third because of all the topics that I wanted to talk about. And we were debating, her and I, what to name this channel, and she came up with the idea of History Obscure. Because, of course, I'm going to talk about famous historical events, places, people, but I also want to shed some light on events and people and places in history that aren't as talked about. Yesterday marked the 50th anniversary of the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Now, that's hardly obscure. The Fitzgerald is very well known in the Great Lakes area and throughout the country thanks to the song by Gordon Lightfoot. I have all the respect in the world for Gordon Lightfoot's talent. After his passing, he was rightfully honored by having the bell that memorialized those lives lost on the Fitzgerald rung 30 times, 29 times for each of the crew, uh, for all the crew members, and once more for him. That being said, even as brilliant a writer as he was, couldn't include every detail of that night. His song told the story of the Fitzgerald, but there was one element that was left out. I can't blame him because the song's already close to 7 minutes long. But I do wish that the song had mentioned the involvement of the Arthur M. Anderson and Captain Bernie Cooper. Bernie Cooper had experience dating back to 1940. So by the time the Fitzgerald sank, he had 35 years' experience. That's a pretty good record. And the night of the storm that sank the Fitzgerald, he and the Fitzgerald had been traveling together for some time on that voyage because they both knew a storm was coming and they decided the safest thing to do was stick together. And it was lucky that he did, that Captain Cooper stayed with her because the radar was completely wiped out of the Fitzgerald by the storm. The Fitzgerald had two radar systems and the wind and the waves took them both down. Given that and the wind and the rain, nobody on the Fitzgerald had any clue where they were going. And the Anderson kept her on radar and tried to guide her as best she could. They were only 15 miles from Whitefish Bay from safety when the Fitzgerald sank, but they would never have made it that far without the Anderson. Those conditions were absolutely terrible, and Captain Cooper talks a bit here about just how bad they were and how bad things were on his own ship.
With all that extra water on deck, at times I had as much as 12 feet on my deck at times. And I know my hatch crane was completely buried a few times.
About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the Fitzgerald radioed the Anderson that she had trouble. She had water coming in. They stayed in contact with the Anderson doing the only thing she could do, which was to guide the Fitzgerald. They kept her on radar, as I said, and at about 10 after 7 p.m., between one radar blip and the next, the Fitzgerald disappeared. It happened that fast. Now, Captain Cooper, of course, had his own crew to look out for, his own ship to look out for, and at that point, there was already pretty much no doubt that the Fitzgerald was simply gone, and all hands on her were almost certainly dead. And yet he continued to try to radio for help for the Fitzgerald as he advanced, doing the only other thing he could do, which was keep headed toward Whitefish Bay. The problem with radioing for help was the wind and the waves had taken out pretty much any radio any ship or any Coast Guard in the area had. It was a nightmare to try to contact anyone. Finally, as they reached Whitefish Bay, he got a hold of the Coast Guard. and they asked him, would you go out again into this storm and try to find the Fitzgerald?
Captain Norad, he asked me if I'd personally go back out, and I was reluctant to go, really I was. But he said there's a ship on the bottom, and I felt like saying there could be two if I go back, but I finally decided I'd go out.
I think it's fair to say that anybody would have hesitated to go back in those conditions, especially knowing there was no realistic hope. And yet, Captain Cooper asked the crew of the Anderson to go back out there. Here we have an actual radio transmission between him and the Coast Guard.
Roger, we have it. Do you think there's any possibility that you could come about and go back there and do any searching? Over. Oh, God, I don't know. The sea out there is tremendously large. If you want me to, I can, but I'm not going to be making any time. I'll be lucky to make 2 or 3 miles an hour going out back out that way.
It was the Anderson that first came across the debris field that marked where the Fitzgerald had sank. Captain Cooper recounts here how the debris field looked and what it consisted of.
A lot of debris, gas tanks, for the stoves, life preservers, oars, canisters, but no sign of anybody else.
I said earlier that Captain Bernie Cooper's career began in 1940. He continued to have a very long career after the Fitzgerald sinking. He retired in 1993, sadly passing away that same year. He worked right up to the end of his life. I consider him to be a true hero. He did as much as he could to help, even when no real help was possible. Now I have to say a few things about the Arthur M. Anderson. The Anderson was launched in 1952, 6 years before the Fitzgerald, and incredibly is still in use, averaging about 11 trips a year on the Great Lakes. She's currently laid up in Toledo, Ohio, having repairs made. Ironically, Toledo is also where the Fitzgerald had her last inspection, where they were told, yeah, you've got some damage to your hatches, but you'll be good for one more trip before the shipping season ends. It would be, of course, anytime there's a shipwreck, it would be a tragedy, but I can't imagine that happening to the Anderson. And so many ore carriers have been scrapped, I hope that is not the Anderson's eventual fate. If it were up to me, I say preserve her, make a museum out of her. This is hardly unheard of. It's been done with many other ships. And I would love to see that be the Anderson's ultimate fate. When I began this video, I mentioned that it was sad that neither Captain Cooper nor the Anderson are mentioned in the famous song Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. However, my sister Rue sent me a video yesterday of a song that was written and performed for them by Dan Hall, and I'm going to include here a brief clip from that song.
Oh, the Arthur M. Anderson still sails the water. Captain Cooper's gone now. In 93 he died. Another skipper charts her, the ship he loved so dearly. But the legend of Cooper and Fitzgerald didn't die.
The Edmund Fitzgerald is never going to be forgotten. But I hope that when people remember the Fitzgerald, they also remember the Anderson and Captain Cooper, because they were a large part of that night. I hope you enjoyed this video, and until next time, take care.